Welcome back to For All Kerbalkind. The first decade has passed. We are now on to 1960, and the Soviet Union has a clear lead over us in the space race. So let's go ahead and jump in to the next episode here. Now, there is something I do want to talk about while we load up the save. We have moved our save from 181 to 110.1, and that has mostly gone surprisingly smooth. We have to sort of adjust our craft in the editor, but they still load. Like, we have to replace fins and various things that have sort of messed up in translation between 181 and 110.1. Some of the contracts have disappeared now. Like, for instance, the communications network contract is just sort of not there. And I believe I accepted that towards the end of last episode. So that is a discrepancy between that one and this one. I'm not sure if they're further along in the contract tree, I guess. Also, apparently this is showing up every single time. I'm just gonna hide this window at startup. Okay, so yeah, that's something. Like, if we go into contracts here, see 6 of 7. Archives, it's not like it auto-completed or anything anywhere in here. Active are, yeah, our communications network satellite contract. Non-existent. I don't remember if we accepted that or not, but it doesn't exist anywhere in here, which is very interesting. And there was, I think, a few things have moved in the R&D building as well, in the tech tree. Most notably, hydrazine has moved from this here. We haven't moved here temporarily, but it does not actually live here anymore. This is just here for debugging purposes. It actually has moved not 1, 2, or 3, but 4 tech nodes down the line to docking and crew transfer. This is where hydrazine lives now. So Explorer 7 that used hydrazine technically shouldn't have used it, but we've talked to Beardy about this and we're allowing the craft to exist. But we'll just say that it was a one-off thing and we're not able to really produce it again until we research a lot. So that's pretty much where we're at right now. And I gotta say, this year we've gotta do something to catch up to the Soviets, or so help me Kraken. I don't know if we're gonna have a chance at this. February 11th, 1960. After a month and a half, initially flying past the moon at a great distance, Explorer 7 approaches lunar space once again, all the while streaming data at a very slow rate of speed back down to the Earth. A small burn of 69 meters per second is all that's needed to capture into orbit of the moon for good. The small Explorer turns itself away from the sun for a moment to fire its thruster anti-tangent at Paraloon. Due to an unknown reason, while this happens, its center of mass is ever so slightly shifted according to telemetry, causing the RCS thrusters to fire in an attempt to hold attitude during the burn. Despite this fuel efficiency loss, this successfully slows its relative speed to the moon anyway, enough to remain in a highly eccentric orbit, providing a broad range of altitudes for pictures and data to be taken. What little fuel remains can be used to further lower Explorer 7's orbit, but will most likely be saved for very conservative station keeping. Alright, mission success! We have plenty more funds to do things with, and we have plenty of science to do things with. So what we're going to do is head into the mission control, and what we're met with is absolutely insane. Crewed lunar flyby, right? We have an advance of 3.5 million funds. Is going to give us so much money to speed up our program, to speed up research, to speed up our builds, to upgrade our facilities to match their capabilities, maybe even surpass their capabilities, but we'll have to see. The catch is, well, we have to launch a crewed ship to fly by the moon. That's probably going to be Gemini or, of course, Gemini. It's the beginning of the decade. Of course I have confidence in this. And instead of just dawdling over it anymore, we're going to just boom. We did it. We're making moves. Okay, first thing we're going to do is buy a new launch pad. And we have a 150-ton launch pad. We're going to just completely gloss over the 350-ton launch pad and grab a 700-ton launch pad. The next thing we're gonna do is research and development, another $500,000 to upgrade this, plus 50% research rate once it's complete. That's another $500,000 funds gone. The next thing we're gonna buy is mission control upgrade. This will give our max active contracts a limit of 10 instead of 7. This is gonna just pay for itself immediately, so click. In 45 days, The vehicle assembly building will have upgraded, and it still has the stats of what we're getting here. If I hover over this, we'll get a second build queue, which will start at absolutely nothing, and then we'll get plus 25% on our current line. So, the next thing we're going to spend a ton of money on is upgrade points. All right, so this is what we're left with. 195 points in the VAB, 192 points in R&D. Of course, there's a few points in wall-ups here, which wall-ups we are pretty much putting on the back burner right now. This space race is really kicking off. It's really getting spicy. So our main focus is going to be this site here at Brownsville. All right, as much as I want to get to this engine right here, the RL-10, I'm actually going to go down here and get early interplanetary avionics and probes first because of the aforementioned Mars window coming up. There's actually a Mars and a Venus window coming up at the end of the year and the beginning of next year, and I want to make sure I can build missions for those ahead of time. So we're grabbing this one, and we'll have plenty of time to build something. My goodness. And one last thing, I want to grab Explorer 7, and I want to lower our periapsis ever so slightly. My god, that is a beautiful sight of the moon and the Earth behind Explorer 7. The camera's kind of pointing the wrong way, but that's okay. We've got work to do. 18 kilometers, that's a bit risky. That's a bit of a risky biscuit right there. Let's see. God damn, that is low. I think that we're fine. I think that will be fine. I really hope Explorer 7 doesn't crash into the surface. I couldn't be bothered to turn it around right now though, because I'm pretty confident that that is fine. But that is where we're gonna leave it, at a paraloon of 18.4 kilometers. Very low. That's gonna get us a lot of low science, and that's kind of the goal. We have unlocked the communications node right before our next Mercury flight. So that means we're gonna go ahead and spend 100K to upgrade our tracking station. And now that is going to take, that's only gonna take 23 days, and we'll have level 3 DSN. That's pretty nice. In theory, that will be enough to communicate between Earth and Mars or Venus. In theory, we'll have to test that out. Builds for that are going to be waiting for this node here in 40 days, and since we have 25.7 science now, it's been trickling down, I think, all from Explorer 7, which is really, really nice, because take a look at this. Early power generation and storage, level 1 solar panels are doing much better, and hinged solar panels. This has a lot of procedural things about it. That'll be really nice. So we're going to do that because our solar panels really leave a lot to be desired. So that means in 78 days, we will have, I think, the technology that I would like to send things interplanetary. And now, honestly, this money sitting right here, 733,000 funds, is sort of burning a hole in my pocket. If it's just sitting there, sure, that's a safety blanket, right? But I think I would rather invest that money into our build speeds and research speeds and let that money work for us. So I'm gonna go ahead and slap in a bunch more points. And I went ahead and put 8 in Rate 1 VAB and 8 in the R&D building. March 26th, 1960. While the Astral Foundation is making great strides in both lunar exploration and crewed spaceflight, the United States still falls behind the Soviet Union by a long shot. Realizing this, the US government steps in with a huge sum of cash and a signed agreement to send a crewed spacecraft around the moon and back before March of 1965. This significant goal repurposes future mission plans for Merkury III and onwards, but today Eileen sits atop the Atlas A for her second orbital flight. Now, if you're wondering, what about Peter? Well, the seat was initially planned for Peter, but he once again has refused to be strapped into a largely uncontrollable tin can while sent into space. With the possibility of a more advanced, maneuverable Mercury capsule being flown soon, he has opted to sit out until that day comes. Midday, the Atlas A lights her engines, and Eileen is away. 5.5 minutes after liftoff, Merkury II pulls away from the Catalyst. Eileen is in orbit of the Earth. Here she will stay for the next 24 hours, communicating with ground control stations, monitoring fuel, oxygen, and voltage levels, and on this particular flight, photographing the Earth from her window and a small periscope underneath the spacecraft. These pictures will be much higher quality than anything current weather satellites are capable of, and in all reality is probably the most exciting thing Eileen has done yet. She'll be taking pictures of cloud formations, significant geographic locations, and if possible a few certain Soviet launch sites and factories, the locations of which are classified information. But before all of this takes place, on her first orbit around the Earth, Flight Control conveys their wishes for Eileen to slightly raise her orbit at apogee. This is met with immediate warranted confusion, as the Merkury II only has re-entry thrusters at its disposal for any kind of translation control, all three of which are needed to bring Eileen back home safe at the desired location on Earth. Well, it turns out Flight has thought about this and recommends a one-of-a-kind maneuver to raise her orbital velocity, something they have decided to call the seesaw. Since pitch control is only located at the front of the spacecraft, Eileen is to first orient prograde, before then pitching up and down back and forth to provide thrust in the forward direction. This maneuver proved quite nauseating in practice, and Eileen promptly utilizes a sick bag stowed in the capsule to keep herself from, well, hurling all over the console. But the seesaw works. Merkury II is now in its desired orbit. The stars are very clear on the night side of the Earth, and in a few moments, when she's feeling a bit better of course, Eileen will have plenty of time to observe them, as well as the entire planet Earth during the day. Simply feeling lucky to be where she is now. After 25 hours in orbit of the Earth, a ground station in the Hawaiian Islands instructs Eileen when to fire her retro thrusters for re-entry. Unlike Merkury I, the retro burn is initiated at the correct time, and Eileen is on course to splash down in the Gulf of Mexico. Frequently monitoring DC voltage in the capsule, its clear electric charge is dwindling. Jettisoning the retro pack and reorienting to re-entry attitude, Flight estimates about 20 minutes before the capsule goes dark, even after shutting down the scrubber and O2 pressurizer. Given that time frame, unless something goes horribly wrong, cutoff will occur while still falling through the atmosphere, which simply means Eileen must manually deploy her chutes and prepare for splashdown. Prepared for this, Eileen sends down a short "see you guys on the ground" flight as plasma begins to form around the spacecraft. Parachutes deploy, and Eileen falls safely to the ocean just as planned. That's 2 orbital flights under her belt now, and a lot of photographs have been taken that the Astro Foundation is eager to study. So after Merkury II, we have a bunch more science here, which is awesome, and I think we almost got 400,000 funds from the flight. Eileen's retirement date has been pushed back by 270 days. As for additional contracts, we're going to grab the second lunar orbiter contract. This requires a less loose orbit of the moon. We have to bring the Apolloon below 500,000 meters. And we'll also grab this one. It's a rather simple satellite mission that will net us about 100,000 funds total. It's something that actually disappears once we complete it to simulate the transfer of the payload back to the customer. So it's sort of like we're doing some commercial work. But we have over a year to complete it, and it's not really going to take all that much. 100k funds, I mean, we'll accept that because we have room for more contracts. We're going to have room for 3 more in a week or 2 when the mission control actually upgrades as well. The next Orbital Flight 1 crew mission requires us to stay in orbit for a day and 7.5 hours, so longer than the other Merkury flights. This shouldn't be an issue. We just have to rework the next Merkury a little bit for that. But I'm not going to accept it yet. We're going to accept it once the mission control upgrades. This one here, orbital flight with maneuvers and 2+ crew, we're just gonna have to wait for Gymnopdie because, you know, 2+ crew and staying up for a week, that's not something that Merkury is capable of. But right now, our 7th contract is gonna be the first Mars flyby because we have, what, 7 years? So we're gonna spend 600,000 funds on more points here. And what we're gonna do with them is we're gonna put 12 into R&D. We're going to put 8 into rate 2 for our VAB and 10 into rate 1 for our VAB. And as for our 50.9 science, there are 2 tech nodes I would like to grab that will further help our interplanetary probes on their way. So this first one is stability, because we have this Ranger/Mariner propulsion system, which burns hydrazine, which is freaking really good. It's a very low thrust, 2 ignition engine with a very low failure rate. I think this will help tiny probes out a lot. So we're gonna grab that one. And then we're also go down here to early human spaceflight era science. This will give us the infrared radiometer and the orbital perturbation experiment. This one is a 10-year-long experiment. It requires something to be in high inclination. So we're going to be sending some satellites out with these. But our interplanetary definitely will have this one, I'm thinking. So I'll research that one as well. Now let's time warp ahead to our mission control being completed. There we go, the building popped up there. So now we can get 3 more contracts. And we are going to grab Orbital Flight 1 crew, which by the looks of things, over time, I guess these have cycled and the reach specified orbit is different now. It's only 18 hours. And that is something that Merkury III is capable of without any further modifications. So, okay, that's perfect. We'll accept that contract. We're gonna take first Millennia orbit satellite just to get the funds and just to see if there's anything past that I'm missing out on if I don't do it. So we're gonna accept that. And then lastly, we're gonna grab the Venus flyby contract. This only gives us 3 years to complete it, but I'm pretty sure we've got a shot at doing this. And if we have to decline it, we only lose about 6,000 funds. So we'll grab that. We have 10 contracts. We're maxing out our funds as much as possible. And with the advanced funds from those contracts, we are going to grab a few more points here. Some to our VAB first line, and then 1 more here to our R&D as well. And warp to complete. R&D building is going to be complete. There we go. We added some more buildings, and this is going to speed things up a whole lot, hopefully. So 2 launch events happened from the Soviets in April, the first of which is Pagoda 6. And if we clear up all of our other satellites there, we are left with this in a very low polar orbit of the Earth. And we're unsure exactly what it is, but we have some suspicions about it. And another one that was launched towards the moon and launched on the 14th of April and was captured into a polar orbit here. And that is significant. They now have 3 orbiters around the moon, except was able to capture into a lower orbit. Now this is something we're looking to do as well. Now that we have some launch vehicles capable of it, all we have to do is find the time to slot a mission for it. June 9th, 1960. A brand new Catless B sees its debut flight tonight. Its mission veiled in secrecy. What very few members of the public know about tonight's launch is that it's labeled as a test article for future Merkury missions. This couldn't be further from the truth. Previous Merkury flights, and the culmination of spaceflight knowledge so far, has been testing enough for the spacecraft sitting aboard the Catless right now. And inside this new iteration of Merkury sits Peter Kerman, finally agreeing to fly in a tin can given its new and improved capabilities once in orbit of the Earth. Flight gives Peter the go-ahead for launch, and the mission is on its way. So why the secrecy if this is merely a technological evolution of Merkury? Surely the public would be more than happy to see its tax dollars hard at work, especially a demonstration of new technology that could rival the Soviet Union. Well, Merkury III's objective will be to rendezvous with Sputnik II, the first satellite to orbit the Earth 5.5 years ago. The hope is to gain insight on Soviet technology by getting up close and personal with it. And what better way to keep that secret than to do it in Earth orbit? Now this comes with some complications, namely Sputnik's orbital inclination of 45.9 degrees. Due to lifting off during late hours, this requires the Catalyst to fly over the east coast of the United States rather than over the ocean, something that could be catastrophic should a failure occur. But Catalyst's reliability has been stellar thus far, and so the mission is decidedly considered a low-risk black op. 5 minutes after liftoff, and Peter is in orbit of the Earth. Now begins the second half of the journey, a much more time-consuming one, somehow making his way to a tiny satellite currently on the other side of the planet. Flight Control immediately begins to calculate maneuvers as Peter monitors the spacecraft. After a few moments, Flight calls up to Peter saying the initial orbit is higher than intended, and reaching Sputnik will only be possible if it is lowered, and then raised again in a dozen or so orbits. This will allow Mercury to catch up to Sputnik over time, but it will take almost all of his orbital fuel to do this. But the decision is made. Merkury III is go for transfer. Peter corrects the slight inclination error in his trajectory on the first orbit, and then is ready to lower his orbit at the next perigee. The initial orbit was 680 by 143 kilometers. Peter is instructed to lower his apogee to 312 kilometers on the first orbit. Unfortunately, this is determined to be ineffective at catching up to Sputnik. During the second orbit, Peter is instructed to further lower his apogee to 143 kilometers. This will put Merkury III in a very, very low circular orbit. Any lower, and they would risk dealing with the atmospheric drag pulling him back to the Earth. His orbit will serve as a parking orbit, waiting for the right moment to raise the apogee and hopefully meet Sputnik at some point in time. 12.5 hours later, Peter is instructed to burn 86 meters per second of his remaining 169 meters per second of fuel to raise his orbit. This will bring Mercury's closest approach to Sputnik to roughly 437 kilometers away. Now, that's still pretty far, but over the course of 3.5 orbits, the two craft will creep closer and closer to each other, before Peter simply has to burn 3.5 meters per second, placing the two craft's trajectories on a 9.5 meters per second very close pass further along in that same orbit. At a precise time, Merkury burns that final 9.5 meters per second to cancel relative velocity. The two craft are now side by side, performing the first orbital rendezvous in spaceflight history. Now is Peter's chance to test out the new translation controls present on the Mercury spacecraft. In addition to pitch, yaw, and roll, Peter is able to move laterally as well. Using this new maneuverability, he brings himself to a stop merely 9 meters from Sputnik. The sight is out of this world.
Merkury III, this is Flight. How's it going up there?
Good to hear your voice, Flight. 5/5 on UHF. Doing real good up here, how about you?
Just fine, we hear you just fine, Merkury III. You know the routine.
Oxygen, go. Suit cabin pressure is go. Fuel is, well, expectedly low, but we're still go for re-entry. I'm a bit worried about voltage, Flight, but all batteries are go.
Any deviations from the previous checkup?
Oh, no deviation, Flight, but we're sitting right on the line here.
Okay, yeah, we see you on telemetry, Peter. This will be your last orbit before retro burn. Clock still running?
Yeah, time to retro is go, Flight.
Roger that, Merkury III, checkup complete. We got another test for you, Peter.
Okay, Flight. Can't say I'm preoccupied with anything at the moment, so go ahead.
Well, Peter, we're gonna lose you before the sun sets, but NASA wants you to give translation controls a whirl. It's gonna get real dark, but from what you've been telling us, we think the horizon will be a good place for Alpha to sit in relation to you. What do you think?
Well, Flight, yeah, Alpha has been absolutely still. It's a hell of a sight. Translation could not be easier. I think I've really gotten the hang of it here. We'll go.
Copy that, good to hear. You're going to have to do your best not to lose sight of Alpha and let us know how it goes.
Will do, Flight, will do. Copy that.
could you turn off the recorder? I'd like to go over that alpha decay proposition with you again. Please turn off the recorder.
After taking a few dozen photographs of the satellite, the sun begins to approach the horizon, meaning very soon, Sputnik will be in near complete darkness. Peter has to get creative in order to maintain station keeping. With nothing but the small window in front of him and a periscope below, Peter maneuvers his tin can in such a way that directly in front of him, Sputnik is contrasted by the fleeting sunlight bleeding through the atmosphere on the horizon of the Earth. Using this, the stars above the horizon and the city lights beneath him, visual tracking is maintained sustainably. Though it is noted the task would likely be much easier with an external light of sorts and a larger window to view through. This will be Merkury III's final orbit of the Earth, for all intents and purposes, tethered to the Sputnik II satellite. Once daylight again appears, Peter will pull away and come back home to a targeted splashdown quite a ways south of Los Angeles, where the US Navy is already awaiting recovery. On 6/9/60, late at night, Merkury III launched from Brownsville in a 45-degree inclination northeast on a trajectory over the east coast of the United States. It is believed to be an uncrewed test of higher inclinations and an advanced capsule design capable of orbital maneuvering. This is partially a lie. In reality, Merkury III was crewed by Peter Kerman with the intended goal of orbital rendezvous with Sputnik II for observational, informational, and demonstrative purposes. On June 10th, 23 hours from liftoff, Merkury III has completed its goal, departed from station keeping, and now has returned to the Earth. The Astral Foundation attempted to forward the following sentiment. It's an honor to visit the first Kerbal-made object to orbit the Earth. This relic holds significance not only to the story of your people, but to the story of all Kerbalkind. Through a time of conflict and world tension between our powers, we salute you. The US government blocks this message from being sent. Several decades from now, the documents and photographs taken from this mission will likely be declassified. But for now, the entire operation is not spoken of outside of closed doors. So this uncrewed test flight of the Mercury Enhanced capsule is complete. We were unable to complete the Orbital Flight 1 crew contract because our perigee was lower than 190 kilometers for that period of time, which means we'll probably have to do this again. I did not pay attention to the orbital parameters very closely. Something else of note is the rendezvous contract. Apparently the game accidentally completed it for me a little bit before we actually launched the mission, and that would have given me 202,000 funds, which I had in reserve already, so that's all taken care of, and I didn't spend that money. Peter's retirement date has pushed back to 1962 sometime, and all in all, we have lots of money and lots of science again. These are gained from gaining science, so I'm going to put those right into our R&D speed. And I figure after a successful Black Ops flight like that, we're going to want a bunch of money here and just dump them all into the first-rate VAB and just get that even higher. Now, it's a decision between going to this node and going to this node right now, because this node will give us the Titan II upgrades to those engines, which will allow us to fly the Gemini capsule. Gemini capsule here is going to have to wait for this node here and itself, so that's 100 science, so 137 science. And I could get this now to speed up that process, but I really think that we'll be able to utilize this engine. And so that's what I think we are going to do. 52 days to unlock that one. All right, our deadline to complete this Orbital Flight 1 crew is in 164 days, and I just don't think with the upcoming planetary windows that we're going to be able to squeeze this in. So we're going to have to cancel that contract, which brings our funds down a little bit, but we'll be able to accept it again at a later time when we have more time to do so. August 8th, 1960. Our attention turns to the Wallops launch site, now ready for their third flight of the Skout rocket. Skout 3 now has improved lighter avionics for each stage of the vehicle, and the Skout satellite is more advanced as well. Solar panel technology has improved. The previous satellite is still having difficulties holding charge, but that should now be a thing of the past. Additionally, more than simple communications, scientific data will be collected on orbital perturbation in an inclined low Earth orbit. The Astral Foundation is looking to study trajectory deviations due to gravity and/or other factors, and Skout theoretically fits the bill. A very inexpensive bill, that is. 2 seconds after liftoff, the Algol booster fails explosively. Teams recover what they can from the wreckage and clear the launch site for the next launch. August 16th, 1960. Another Skout rocket in storage was quickly assembled after the failed launch on the 8th. A week and a day later, Skout 4 attempts this same mission. Unfortunately, this launch meets the same fate 11 seconds after liftoff. The range safety officer detonates the vehicle into a ball of fire before it can fall back to the surface. The first stage of Skout has a predicted chance of failure of only 1.33%, so these back-to-back catastrophes are going to cause the Foundation to scratch their heads for a while. Skout 5 begins construction nonetheless. 2 Skouts failed in a row, and they have about a 1% chance of failure. That is just crap luck. I'm really hoping that that's all the bad luck we'll see this year. If we roll this out on the 150-ton pad, we're down to 1,558 funds. So if Synkom 1 fails, we do have a failsafe to be able to roll out Markiner 1, and that is scrapping Discoverer 3 for an unknown amount of funds, hopefully enough to actually cover the cost of rolling out Markiner. So fingers crossed, everyone. September 12th, 1960. Catalyst B sees its second operational flight in the hands of the Foundation. Its payload today is a satellite called Synkom 1, intended to reach a geostationary orbit. The Soviets have managed this feat last year, and though their intentions are still unclear, an orbit that high would provide fantastic communications coverage for practically an entire side of the Earth at a time, better than any low Earth satellites are capable of, that's for certain. Late in the evening, the mission lifts off from Brownsville. 5 minutes after liftoff, Synkom 1 is in orbit of the Earth and pushes away from the Catalyst. The transfer stage to reach geostationary altitude is an upgraded Pathfinder upper stage, now called Cable. The stage is underfueled to minimize launch mass and still provide enough thrust to reach the correct velocity for the transfer. The burn now complete, a maneuver is plotted to both circularize and plane change the final orbit. After adjusting to the correct attitude, Synkom is spin stabilized by Cable and then let go. It will now remain stable and pointing the right way for its final burn. Reaching the right altitude at the right time, Synkom lights its final kick stage. The goal is a perfectly circular 35,793,172 kilometers altitude orbit with an inclination of 0 degrees. This is not perfectly met by any means, but is close enough for all intents and purposes. And there exists 14 meters per second of delta V from helium-fueled thrusters for a small correction if desired. If anyone were able to see the Earth from Synkom's point of view, it would appear motionless in the dark void behind it. This satellite only broadcasts on a slow-speed UHF frequency, and relay capabilities prove to be ineffective. So Synkom 1 really only exists as a proof of concept. Back down on Earth though, a possible plan for a small network of geosats hits the drawing board. Mission is successful. I haven't included any other build time lapses in the video so far, and I think this is actually going to be the only one, just so that I can try to keep the video length under 1 hour. There's a whole lot of information I have to cram into this because of a whole year of playing through. But what we're seeing on the screen here is our first interplanetary probe. And if you know the shape of some early interplanetary probes, you'll probably be able to tell that this is based off of the Mariner probe. Now, the Mariner probe was NASA's interplanetary probe to Mars and Venus in the mid-60s, and we're launching it in 1960. This one is specifically called Markiner I. We had to put a K in there somewhere, okay? I know Beardy said in his video it was kind of a stretch, but we gotta put the K in there somewhere. But anyways, the whole struggle with the build of this spacecraft was making it weigh as absolutely little as possible. At first, it was just trying to figure out, okay, how much mass do I have to work with? And I came to the conclusion that I have about 0.2 tons to work with. Any more, and we won't have the Delta V to really reach our targets. So yeah, this thing is absolutely tiny. And it's a struggle because we need it to have full avionics control. We need that heavy, very power-hungry antenna to communicate with Earth from interplanetary distances. And we need, well, along with the avionics control, some fuel and some thrusters. And we need all those science experiments as well. So it's a struggle of having fuel, having electric charge, having science experiments, and all that weighing only 0.2 tons. And launching this vehicle is a brand new few upper stages. It's going to be launched on a Catalyst, but we've also built 2 upper stages, both present on the conceptualized Atlas Vega. I would have liked to use the Centaur upper stage, but we don't have the RL-10s yet. Pretty much at the beginning of the year, I spent about 15 to 20 hours, and I did a few live streams on Twitch of just building launch vehicles with the new technology we unlocked from the engines tech node we unlocked earlier on in the year. And I'm not going to be showing that footage on the stream, like I said, just to keep the video time low. But yeah, a lot of work went into that, and the Catalyst Vega was the only thing that was able to lift enough tonnage into low Earth orbit, specifically 3.5 tons. Now, we're not pushing the burn times to the limit on this one. There's actually some Delta V leeway, and that is simply because both of the upper stage engines have about a 10 or 15% chance of engine failure and full burn failure. So it is very, very likely that these engines will fail. But the Mars window and Venus window that are coming up are just too good to miss. So I am rolling the dice and hoping for the best. September 16th, 1960. Astronomers from all over the world have been gazing up to the stars, studying them and wondering about them. A handful of small dots in the sky are understood to be planets, and only through the use of telescopes has Kerbalkind been able to identify different characteristics about these distant tiny dots in the sky. Their location is predictable. Some are known to have many moons, some rings, some with atmospheres, and one such dot is the planet Mars. Practically nothing is known of this distant world that so consistently circles our horizon. It has an atmosphere which some have come to assume is like our own. Suspicions of seasonal plant growth or little green men depending on who you ask. Well, the Astral Foundation sets out to more closely analyze this planet, better than any instruments on the surface of the Earth will ever be able to. A camera, among various other scientific instruments, is to be carried by a spacecraft called Markiner. Markiner I will lift off on a brand new iteration of the Catalyst launch vehicle, one with not 1, but 2 upper stages, the Catalyst Vega. 9 minutes after liftoff, soaring above the southern tip of Florida, Markiner 1 is in orbit. A maneuver just shy of 4 kilometers per second is plotted for the Trans-Mars injection burn. The Astral Foundation has yet to establish a dedicated communications network, though thankfully a ground station is in the right place and the right time to monitor TMI. The stage is set. Despite an initial failure and immediate relight of the Vegas stage, the injection burn is now complete, and the hard part is over. The transfer stage's final objective will be to orient Markiner's attitude towards where the sun will be when we reach the daylight side of the Earth, and then release the space probe for its journey to another world. Now separated and on its own, S-band ground stations pick up communications with spacecraft once line of sight is established. Meanwhile, flight control begins calculating any errors in the trajectory and mapping a small correction to ensure a very close flyby of Mars when Merkury finally arrives 385 days from now. Roughly 20 meters per second of delta V is all that's needed to adjust attitude, correct the trajectory, reorient solar panels towards the sun, and then perform a final velocity adjustment afterwards. According to all calculations and models, on October 6, 1961, Markiner 1 will be just skimming above the atmosphere of Mars, and should all things go well, transmitting pictures and scientific data from the mysterious planet back to eager scientists on Earth. Several months before the launch of Markiner, intelligence picked up on a possible Soviet mission to also fly past the planet Mars, though intel suggests this spacecraft has been put into orbit and spent the last 2 months around the Earth. So realistically, it's assumed the spacecraft has somehow failed, but it's always possible another may be launching anytime soon. But it appears as if both powers have seized the opportunity to explore this distant planet simultaneously. Markiner 1 is a success, but we won't see the funds for that until October next year. So what we're going to do is warp ahead to our next mission, which should hopefully get us some funds. But first we have a tech node unlocking and, oh my goodness, 37. Explorer 7 has been trickling down science from the moon. As little time as it spends in technically low space above the moon, it's been trickling down some science as it collects it from that point. And 37 science is exactly the amount of science that we need to unlock 1962 orbital rocketry. Perfect. And that went to 37 at the exact moment that the tech node for the last tech node finished. That's amazing. November 15th, 1960. Yet another Catalyst is ready for launch in Brownsville. This time, the payload consists of not 1, but 3 satellites. The development of a TLI stage and lunar orbiter weighing 1.3 tons gives the Catalyst B some breathing room in terms of launch capacity. Initially proposed to be launched on a Titan 1 ICBM, the Foundation has opted out of development costs associated with a new launch vehicle at this point in time. So, to fill the mass gap, the payload fairing and orbital avionics system has been fitted to accommodate 2 Skout vehicles and their kick stages. Once in orbit, the plan is to first release the Skout satellites and have their boosters simultaneously perform an inclination change to reach an orbit that deviates greatly from the lunar plane. Then afterwards, Explorer 8 will initiate its mission to orbit the moon. 5 minutes after liftoff, and the Catalyst B has burned through all of its propellant. Telemetry blares a warning light at flight control. Their trajectory is suborbital, and the vehicle has only 10 minutes before re-entering the atmosphere and falling back to Earth. Everyone blows up into a frenzy with no time at all to figure out how to save the satellites, let alone their primary goal. They immediately come up with a 2-part plan. Step 1, fire the Skouts. The orbit is much lower than planned, clearly, and it's not likely the Skout rideshare satellites are able to reach their desired inclination of 50 degrees to meet their scientific experiment orbital parameters. But by orienting anti-normal and just a sliver above the horizon, there's a chance the Skout RS-1 and 2 will be able to reach orbital velocity and reach close to 50 degrees inclination. There's a chance. Both satellites are stabilized at orientation and fire their motors simultaneously. After nearly completing the burn, Skout RS-2's engine experiences a failure and shuts down, leaving its inclination at 40 degrees. SRS-1, on the other hand, gets closer to its goal, reaching 45.4 degrees. Although this won't do for experiments to run, at least the two satellites will live in Earth orbit and not burn up in the atmosphere. Now quickly back to Explorer 8 for Step 2. There's no time to wait for the proper translunar injection the mission was planned for. They have to fire early, while not necessarily aligned to the lunar plane very closely. A maneuver is planned to burn mostly prograde, but also a fair bit radial out to bleed Delta V in order to keep the spacecraft from entirely leaving Earth's sphere of influence on accident. From there, well, the plan is to see what happens, really. Explorer 8 is saved from imminent doom. However, reaching the moon has become tenfold more difficult. The probe is spin stabilized, and its transfer stage can only stay attached for a matter of hours, or else all electric charge will be drained. Furthermore, the projected orbit is still technically suborbital, despite an apogee just a bit further from the moon's altitude from the Earth. This leaves mission planners no choice but to orient the craft in a way that it will achieve prograde attitude in 6 days at its orbit's apogee. Explorer 8 holds roughly 1400 meters per second of delta V, which can be used by both fore and aft-facing RCS thrusters and an aft-facing larger thruster for when higher thrust-to-weight ratio is desired. Reaching apogee, Explorer 8 is able to perform a very small pulse to ensure that it stays out of Earth's atmosphere at perigee. Projecting the trajectory forward reveals a lunar encounter, as eventually expected on a trajectory like this. The peculiar thing is, all models suggest in roughly 75 days, the orbit will flip 90 degrees and go almost perfectly polar due to encountering the moon's gravity. In the end, this will provide a situation for more science gain, since one of the science experiments, identical to the ones found on Skout currently, require an inclination above 50 degrees. Along with one other experiment now running, it's not a total loss. Definitely a mess of a flight profile, but there's still hope for Explorer 8, because who knows how the moon will affect our trajectory further on into the future. Seemingly out of nowhere, Skout RS-2 suddenly relights its solid stage. It appears something has caused the remaining solid fuel to burn off, and this rapidly brings SRS-2 back from Earth orbit to a steep suborbital trajectory, where it will rapidly be destroyed. This unfortunately means only one of the two rideshare Skouts is able to stay in orbit. Regardless, both have technically failed their goal, and the Astro Foundation will definitely think twice about undertaking questionable launches such as this. Alright, that mission admittedly did not go to plan, but that was a very, very fun mess that I had to deal with, and who knows where Explorer 8 will end up in the future. That's going to wrap up all the launches for this year, but there are some sort of housekeeping things I need to take a look at before we close the episode. First of all, our funds. We have 14,500 funds. That's barely enough to roll out some of our next missions here, and I have to decide which one of these is going first. We can accept 2 contracts. We're definitely going to re-accept this one, and we're going to have to fly a Merkury flight just to get a little bit of money, because we desperately need it. Maybe we'll figure out if we can get some science from it as well, but we have all of the Merkury capsule science at this point, so I kind of don't think so. We'll accept that, and now we're a little bit out of the red. I don't think we're going to have time to meet this deadline of the first weather satellite. So what we're going to do is we're going to cancel it, which brings us a little bit back into the red there. But then we're able to accept it again and only lose 3,000 funds while doing so. Now 3 more options are present to us. Early NavSat, which doesn't give us all that much, and the satellite goes away after completing it. We have Orbital Flight with Maneuvers and 2+ crew. This is going to have to wait for Gemini, which we are 100 science away from, and this only has a deadline of 233 days. Truthfully, it's not guaranteed we have Gemini in that short amount of time. So what this would turn into is a contract where we accept, decline, and accept again, but we'd be losing about 20,000 funds every time we do so. I guess the equivalent of the government saying, hey NASA, we need you to put 2 Kerbals up in orbit, and NASA saying, sure, we can do that, and then the deadline comes around and saying, yeah, we're gonna need an extension on that. Now the third one right here, first crewed lunar orbit, gives us 1.5 million funds, and that would be enough to unlock all the new parts that we are unlocking, making sure that we get the science and vehicles ready for Gemini and beyond as fast as possible. Arguably, I was not the best with money this episode, and we would definitely need to be more frugal and more tactical about how we spend this money, especially since it has a 5-year duration, but you cannot decline or you cannot cancel the contract. You just succeed or fail. Is that going to be enough time is the important question. Well, if you think about it, not a whole lot more than 5 years ago, we put our first satellite in orbit of the Earth. And now we've been putting Kerbals up in orbit. We've sent something to Mars. We're struggling to get to lunar orbit with solids and spin-stabilized probes. But still, that is undeniable progress. And with every successful contract we actually end up getting, our progress is exponentially increasing. In the short term, it will help us complete all of these contracts that we have accepted and by their deadlines. And in the long term, oh boy. But you know what? What is a space race if the stakes aren't high? We've accepted it. We're not going back from that now. We have 1.5 million funds instead of practically nothing. But oh man, it's gonna be interesting to see if we can pull that off, and interesting to see what happens to us if we can't. But I'm pretty sure that we're able to. All right, let's add these new contracts into our Kerbal alarm clock window so we can see all the deadlines here in one place. And well, all I can say is we've got our work cut out for us. That's going to be it for this episode of For All Kerbalkind. There have been several suspicious satellites in polar orbit the Soviets have launched, as well as a few other missions that I won't talk about. You'll have to go watch his video to see all the juicy details about them, which should be linked in the end screen and the description below. There's going to be another delay on the next episode because I will be on vacation for a week, but soon enough, we'll try to get back to that every other Sunday schedule. I want to thank you guys so much for being so patient waiting for these videos. And as always, peace out.